Loud.
Will. Hey, Will? Yeah, I'm great. Yes, I'm Ashley's husband.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Nice.
We're not live on Zoom.
No,
Okay.
it's just recording. So if you want to open us with a prayer,
Okay.
and then
Now, can we move that off my notes somehow?
yes, that would be good, huh? Yeah, I think we can. Hold on, Juan's
Or
not
make it
here,
smaller.
but there we go.
Okay.
All right, so this is Don Stacy. I'm gonna let him tell a little bit of his story. I'm gonna put this camera on you.
Let's start with a prayer first, if we could, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And this is the prayer to St. James the Apostle. His feast day was last Sunday, but since it fell on a Sunday in the U.S., during ordinary time, we didn't celebrate that feast day. And he's a very special saint to me. I've walked the to Compostela, Santiago, twice in Spain.
Which
And
is the way of St. James.
the way of
in
St.
England.
James. And so it's a special saint to me. So let's pray. O glorious apostle St. James, who by reason of thy fervent and generous heart was chosen by Jesus to be witness of his glory on Mount Tabor, in his agony in Gethsemane, thou whose very name is a symbol of warfare and victory, obtain for us strength and consolation in the unending warfare of this life, that having constantly and generously followed Jesus, we may be victors in the strife and deserve to receive the victor's crown in heaven. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Can we start out by just going around and just telling your name? And I don't know that I've met but a couple of you. And tell me a little bit about your background and what brought you here.
I'm going to start with me because these two haven't met me, and then I want to go help Teresa get tables up. Sorry.
All right.
I'm Susan Skinner. I'm the director of the Adult Faith Formation in RCIA here at St. Philip. And I'm just introducing myself mostly to you guys because the rest of these people know me. And I have been working here for 7 years. I love Jesus and his church, and I hope that you all will too. And I will be back.
Okay.
I'm Joshua. I formerly Southern Baptist and went through RCIA about 2 years ago and decided to become Catholic just out of the blue. Right. Just had a conviction.
Well, you had a coworker, right? If I remember the story, that you approached her when she was almost through and said, I don't know what you have, but I want some of it. Yeah, that's part of what brought you to the church, correct? Yeah, good story.
I'm Allison Brown. I grew up Methodist. I went to Christian high school. In the last couple of years, since I moved to Tennessee, kept trying to find a church and nothing seems to fit. And so talking with some of my friends that are Catholic, they're sharing their experiences, and that's what got me here. Was that they are having a lot better experience and living their faith than some.
Okay, good.
My name is Colton Vaughn, and I'm started this journey. I grew up Methodist and went to a Christian college, and really decided to go Catholic because my wife is Catholic. So we were talking about how we want to raise our family, and consolidating our faith is obviously important. We want to raise our children Catholic. And probably the biggest reason for me, something that's very similar to you, is a lot of prosperity teaching at the churches in Tennessee, in Middle Tennessee, that are not Catholic. And I just felt like it did seem like that's what, like that does not seem like the God that I know. And I think it's a lot of empty promises for me, and the Catholic faith seems a lot deeper than that kind of faith. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but for me, it didn't talk to me, and I think a lot of respect. I have a lot of respect for like the tradition
Great.
I'm Maggie. I'm his wife. I'm his sponsor. I grew up Catholic. I went to Catholic school, but I did in college kind of find myself come away from the church. But I just felt called back a little while ago and went to confession and we started coming to mass every week. And we had to move our days. That's how we could raise our family when that comes.
How many kids?
We don't have any. We just got married 2.5 weeks ago.
Oh,
And then it's been-
and you've already converted him.
That was decided before we got married.
Now you're Catholic, you're required to at least have 4 children.
I've got a funny story about that. There was a couple here that have been members for 15 years, been married for 15 years or so. And when they got engaged, she was a Baptist, he was a Catholic. And she said, boy, this is going to be a piece of cake. He's going to be a Baptist before I even have the first wedding shower. Worked out the other way around. She's a very devout Catholic now. And so
My name is Jason. I grew up going to Baptist church till I was about 15. And then spent the next 30 years not stepping foot in a church. And just kind of researched for about 1.5 years, different denominations and everything. And then Will and Ashley are, 2 of my good best friends. And, I like the structure of the Catholic Church the most and just, agreed with a lot of the stuff and decided to take my dip.
yeah, I've heard some of your story the first night we met a couple of months ago.
So I'm Will Blackburn, I'm the sponsor. Ashley's my wife that teaches some. I grew up Methodist, so I was a convert. Probably been Catholic. Don't ask me how long I've been married. 13 years, 14 years?
Yeah.
A little bit after. I wasn't Catholic when we got married, so I converted afterwards. But yeah, I've loved it, never looked back. I've been a sponsor 3 or 4 times prior to Jason. So I did the RCIA a lot, and with Ashley being involved, so. Excited to be here. Oh, you never stop learning, so.
Now, well, there's 2,000 years of this history.
Yeah, I barely know this much, and that's probably a stretch.
I'm Finn. These are my parents. So my journey started probably a little over a year ago. I started listening to Bishop Barrett on YouTube. Yeah, I like this stuff. And just found that I started looking more into Catholicism and found that I was kind of agreeing with a lot of what they taught. And then really at the beginning of this year, I heard a talk by Father Mike Schmitz on the Eucharist, and that was a deal breaker for me. It's like I got to get into the Catholic Church, so that's how I ended up here.
Well, I'm Greg Pope, Finn's dad, and I grew up Methodist. A lot of people grew up Methodist here.
I was just going to ask.
But Shannon and I have been in the Presbyterian Church in America for probably 20 years. But I've kind of always known my journey to Catholicism has been a long one. I kind of feel like I knew it was the true church. But we have a big family, and just thinking about raising Catholic kids, I didn't really know what the right time was for that. And it just kind of ended up working out this past year. Finn, I would say, was kind of instrumental in that. But yeah, I've been there a long time, wanted to come here, so that's
Very
kind
good.
of why I'm here.
I'm Shannon Pope. Guys. And yes, that's kind of my journey. I grew up in the Episcopal Church before I got married, and we started going to PCA Church when I was in college, and then when we got married, and I kind of got interested, really driven by Greg and Finn. So I'm here to just kind of learn more. They're a little ahead on their journey than I am, but yeah, I'm here to find out.
Well, this is oversimplistic, but we have many people that come through a family member. Like stories here tonight, Will, and yourself. Very, very common story. We also have those that kind of read their way into the Catholic Church. They start getting into the church fathers and the readings going way back. And you know, they just say, well, my goodness, this is the truth. So, and that's overly simplistic, but that's two big ways that people come into the Catholic Church. In fact, our next slide, St. John Henry Newman, to be deep in history is to cease to be a Protestant. You know, this is probably the most famous convert in the Church of England back in the 19th century. When he converted, it created a huge scandal in England when he came over, and he was finally made a cardinal, probably the last 10, 15 years of his life. He was a priest, he was never a bishop or anything, but back in those days, you didn't have to be a bishop to be named a cardinal. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in the Church of Christ in the Deep South, down in Montgomery, Alabama. It's like fifth generation Church of Christ. My brother, my mother, my parents were devout Church of Christ members until they passed. My brother still is down there, and when I go down to visit, I still go to church with him. And I'm always introduced as Bob's Catholic brother, which is fine. But at any rate, my wife and I got married. You know, I was probably Church of Christ into my mid-20s. My wife and I got married, and she wasn't going to become a Church of Christ member. We were looking for a church, and an Episcopalian priest invited us to church. So the power of just asking somebody to go to church with you is powerful. So we spent the next number of years in the Episcopal Church. About 12 years ago, I was sitting exactly where you are. But 13 years ago or so, you know, I was having kind of a crisis. My faith wasn't where it needed to be. You know, I was not in a good place spiritually, and started questioning a lot of things of where I was in the Episcopal Church. And so I started reading, you know, and it was the Church Fathers, you know, books, and some friends of mine that were Catholic gave me other books to read. So I'm one of these that kind of read his way in. Well, in 2008, my daughter was in nursing school at Aquinas College here in town in Nashville. And she took a course in Thomistic ethics. And one of her textbooks was this, the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And she brought it home. I don't think she read much of it, but I read it from cover to cover. And, you know, after going through it, and you don't have to get very far into this, and I hope everybody has one of these. If not, we can certainly supply you with one. Who's got one? Okay, great. We'll get you one. You don't have to get very far into this when you start seeing citations from St. Augustine and all of the church fathers. And so you go back and you start reading that. And after being into this thing for several months, I said, oh, darn, I think I'm Catholic. And that was in 2009, spring and summer 2009. And that's when I approached the church here. Mary Anderson did RCIA back then. And they had a new class forming at the end of August, 1st of September. And I signed up. And I had told my wife, I'm going to RCIA because I think I'm already a Catholic. And she looked at me and said, I'm not becoming a Catholic. It's not about you, it's about me. I'm going, you don't have to go, but that's where I'm going. And this was probably in May, and the summer went on, June, July, August got here, probably a week before RCA started. And she came and said, all right, I'll go with you, but I'm not going to be a Catholic. I said, that's fine. we went to about 4 of the sessions. And back then we had them on like a Monday night, like this. And they'd go for 2 hours and then they would flip when we got the class going. It was during the day. But after that 4th session, on the way home, she started crying. I said, "What's the matter?" She said, "I wish we had raised these children in this church." That's how deeply it affected her. So we both came into the church at the same time, which was fortunate. And we've never looked back. She's probably more devout than I am in her faith. But I've been involved. This is my 8th class that I've been involved with. I've seen lots and lots of people come through, and I enjoy this ministry probably more than any other ministry I'm involved with, in the church. So I hope your journey is a great one, and we'll be praying for you. We'll have prayer partners for you that'll be praying for you the entire time on your journey. So I hope it's a very good journey for you, and that next Easter, you don't have any regrets about coming into the Catholic Church. So that's Newman. I'm going to go through these pretty quick. The Catechism, paragraph 450. From the beginning of Christian history, the assertion of Christ's lordship over the world and over history has implicitly recognized that man should not submit his personal freedom in an absolute manner to any earthly power, but only to God the Father and to the Lord Jesus Christ. Caesar is not the Lord. The church believes that the key, the center, and the purpose of the whole of man's history is to be found in its Lord and Master. Now, you'll see through church history that many people, including many popes, didn't follow this, which is probably why it had to be written into the Catechism. The Catechism is a second version. The first one was in 1565 after the Council of Trent, and I've got a copy of that too. And it follows along pretty much with the one that came out in 1992 after Vatican II was pulled together by St. John Paul II, and also one of the chief writers of this catechism was Pope Benedict, Cardinal Ratzinger at the time. So get you a copy of that, get into it and read it.
If I give copies to people, need one? You need one? Who else needs one? You guys are good? Okay.
Something else that'll help you along your journey, I've used for years, it's the Magnificat. It's a missal daily. It's got the daily readings in it, meditations and so forth. Also has the Mass, comes out once a month. There's one we give out that's called what? There's another one that we give out, but this one is by subscription only. But people always ask, well, how should I read the scripture? Well, get the missal. There's the daily lessons in there that go throughout the year. Right now, we're in year 2, which is Mark. It goes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John is interspersed in all 3 years. On the daily, if you go to daily Mass, that's on a 2-year cycle. But read the daily, what's the name of the missal that we give out, Susan?
The Word Among Us.
The Word Among Us. You'll see
The
them out.
Magnificat is the other one.
Right, that's the one that I use. But if you're reading the daily lessons, I think that's the best way for you and RCI to get through the year and understand it better, because it's laid out perfectly. They all tie together. Lesson 1, 2, and 3, or during the week it's just 2. But if you go to Mass weekly or daily, the homilies are going to be based on those particular lessons. That's different than a lot of denominations, but they're not tied to any sort of lectionary on what they give their sermons on. So get that. Look for them out in the front of the church in the north X and on each entrance. They'll be there. Not this one, you'll have to subscribe to that, but it's Magnificat.
The Magnificat has the daily readings, and it has prayers you can pray. The Word Among Us, what he's saying is it has a little lesson that goes with the readings for the day. That's like a homily. And all over the world in the Catholic Church, everybody is hearing the same readings. So,
Right. Yep.
yeah.
Not in the same language, but the
Right.
same readings. Central event of human history. Catholics believe that history is not a random series of events. It is the story of God working in the world through his church and his people. There's a beginning, creation, and an end, second coming. One central event upon which the whole of human history hinges, the incarnation. The coming of the God-man and its saving implications is an event that radiates backward and forward in human history. You know, he's hidden in the Old Testament and revealed in the New. But that central event tying them together is that incarnation. I'm going to move on. You've got in front of you it opens up and it's on the front and back, and these are the time periods. And we're not going to have time to get through all of this, but that's 2,000.
1 hour to get through 2,000 years of history.
Right.
Let's go.
But use this as a reference. You know, if you look on there and you see a name or a council or anything that you want to learn more about, you can go out to the bishop's website in the U.S., or you can go on the Vatican and, you know, find all of these documents and things that are, look it up on, well, any of those search engines, but make sure you're going to a good Catholic source, not some satanic source if you're looking up Christ. And, you know, you can do a lot for your own education by that, but it's a lot here. If you're looking through there, we're on the Pope number 260, and that's Pope Francis. I think he's on the back there. I'm sorry, 267 popes. So, and it's interesting if you look at the first several hundred years, I think it's like over half the first 30 or 40 bishops ended up as martyrs. So to be named Pope was a blessing and sometimes a curse, because you may not live very long. The mustard seed is the first one on there, and that's from Pentecost through the death of John the Baptist. We got persecution, conversions, missionaries and the emperor, Crusaders and Scholars, on and on. There's 12 of them. And let's take a look at the mustard seed here, and that's Pentecost AD 33. And at that event there in Jerusalem, you know, the apostles were commissioned by Christ and told to go out in the world, and they did. They went south into Africa, they went east over to Asia and India. They went north into what's now Turkey and other parts there. They went west. The most famous evangelist, Paul, really used those Roman roads to, you know, go far west. He was executed in Rome, but he had planned to go on to Spain in his evangelization efforts. So they scattered and they went all over the place doing exactly what they were told to do. St. James, in fact, went to Spain very early on and came back and was Herod beheaded him. He was the first apostle to die. Interestingly enough, his brother John was the last one to die, and he died a natural death. Even though he was, they tried to kill him more than once.
Right.
And poison him. St. Paul's conversion and journeys, he was out arresting Christians and hauling them back to Jerusalem to be with the charges, and some of them were executed. He was at the foot of the people. Well, he was there when Stephen was martyred, stoned to death in Jerusalem. So he was a pretty nasty guy, you know, in his early days. But, You know, he was sort of knocked off his horse. There's a famous Caravaggio painting depicting that as a very young Paul laying on the ground looking up, a young, muscular, soldierly kind of Paul at that time. And, you know, his conversion took place over a number of years in the learning, and the rest is history. He went all over the Mediterranean, all the way to Rome, preaching and founding churches. Council of Jerusalem was when he had a complaint with St. Peter, and this was over the conversion of Gentiles. You had a group of Jewish Christians that thought that you were becoming a Jew, and you needed to maintain all of the Jewish principles, including getting circumcised. And so that Council of Jerusalem, they laid that aside. They put aside the food laws, except you couldn't eat any meat that was sacrificed to pagan gods, and you couldn't eat anything that was in its own blood. And that was it. So all of those rituals and things were that the Jews wanted them to do were kind of tossed out at the first council. Burning of Rome and Nero. That's in the 50s, I guess it was, when the story is that Nero wanted this section of the town for some construction project. And so he had it burned, and he blamed it on the Christians to kind of get out of it. That's the story anyway. And so that's when a lot of the persecutions there in Rome began. They would gather them up, and he would put them on poles and dip them in something, and they'd light them up like torches, human torches. And that was really your first persecution. Now,
I'm gonna stop you really quick. You might have already said this, but at this point in time, there is no New Testament. Right? So the church was started first. Before we had a New Testament. So because Paul was writing letters to the different churches, so it hasn't been assembled into what we now call the canon of scripture. You might be getting to that.
we will.
And
Now,
and then the other thing was, remember when we talked about Jesus, is he Lord, lunatic, or liar? Like, you don't die, you don't go to your death for a lunatic or a liar.
so, and it wasn't long after that that Paul was put in prison in Rome, and they were both martyred pretty close in time to each other by Nero. That predates, I think that's around 60, somewhere 60 AD. 70 AD is the destruction of Jerusalem, which was foretold even by Jesus Christ, in the Gospels. And that happened in AD 70, destruction of Jerusalem. And there were, estimates are that there were 1 million Jews killed in that destruction of Jerusalem. Now, they were told by Vespasian not to destroy the temple, but they did anyway. It was full of gold, and so they burned it. The gold melted down, and the soldiers took it. They took the grand menorah in the temple and took it back to Rome. In fact, on one of the arches in Rome, you can see a depiction of that menorah carved into that arch. That was in dedication of the army that came back from the destruction of Jerusalem. During this time, Pope Saint Clement I, he was Pope number 4, and he wrote this famous letter to the Corinthians. I guess the Corinthians needed to be corrected an awful lot because they got a lot of letters, most of which were correcting them on things. But it's still out there. You can go read it, but it talks about the church, and it really establishes the See of Peter and the Pope as the head of the church in that letter. Death of the Apostle John, that takes place at the, yes.
I know obviously I think Peter was like one of the originals, but have any of these other
No other pope was a witness to Jesus' crucifixion.
St. Paul didn't even, right?
No.
So it's like, yeah, think about that. I mean, that's just speaks to the power of and the glory of Jesus himself, of these people that never met him, and go on to do these great things. So.
It was the end of the first century, around AD 100. No one knows the correct time on it, but that's when the Apostle John died. So, the apostles lived all through that first century. So that's a long time from when he was executed. Jesus at AD 33. It's almost another 70 years that John was out there teaching over in the east in what is now Turkey.
I think if you guys, just a side note, if you read scriptures, we talked about Corinth got a lot of letters. Well, they were like a pagan, totally fornicating society. So getting that out of them, like, would take more. When you read like the letter to the Hebrews, it's a very different tone than to what was written to Corinth, because they're in two different places spiritually, and the Corinthians are like spiritual babies, where with the Hebrews they would have had all these laws that they were following, so they wouldn't have needed. And I find it interesting that the words in Hebrews are harsher. Corinth is like, love is patient, love is kind.
Until you get to 2 Corinthians.
Right, 2 Corinthians, but the 1 Corinthians, I think Paul was probably like, I have to be patient and kind to you because you're babies in the faith. So anyway.
Yeah. Right. Let's move on to persecution, and you can see the look down there at the popes. From Pope, look at all those that were martyred through there on the top. If they're in red on the popes up there, and then all through there, they were martyred. So you can see the list of the popes up top that were martyred. That's, 8 out of 10 of them. And you've got some that are blank and missing there. I've got the full list in another document. But then you look down at the bottom here, the historical figures and the saints. St. Ignatius of Antioch, St. Polycarp, Justin Martyr, Felicity and Perpetua, and on and on and on through that period of time. Justin Martyr was a Roman, and he wrote letters to the emperors. Marcus Aurelius was emperor when he was executed, but Marcus Aurelius, his father or stepfather, was emperor as well. And Justin Martyr was writing to them about what the Christians were, what they believed and what they didn't believe. There was this concept then that they were cannibals because they ate the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. And he tried to explain that on and on to them. Probably Marcus Aurelius was not as bloodthirsty as many of them, but he did have Justin Martyr executed.
And that's actually where we have one of the earliest descriptions of the Mass is from Justin Martyr. And again, scripture's not compiled yet, but we have writings from him that are describing the Mass.
Let me back up to St. Ignatius of Antioch. He was captured in Antioch, and they took him to Rome. They were going to feed him to the lions and have the wild beasts tear him apart. On the way, he wrote 7 letters to 7 different churches along the way, and they're out there today. You can read them. There's a book with all the letters of St. Ignatius out there. And he describes, he'll tell you to be loyal to your bishop, and many of the things that he describes are going on in the Catholic Church today. What we do is ancient. One of the recipients of one of those letters was St. Polycarp of Smyrna. He wrote a letter to Smyrna, he wrote letters to others. I don't know that the two ever met, but Ignatius had a big influence on Polycarp. Saint Irenaeus of Lyon writes against heresies, and that was confronting which heresy was that?
I missed the name.
Saint Irenaeus, I've got it here somewhere. Against heresies, Gnosticism.
Yeah.
Gnosticism exists today. It predates Christianity, but it's the belief that matter is bad, only the spirit is good. Matter, being the body, is bad. And they thought, many of the Gnostics, that the best way to die was by suicide because you could free the spirit from this awful body that you were inhabiting. And he spoke against that. But you see that today I think you see it in some of this movement too, with people that say, I'm not a man, I'm a woman. So they just decide they can change their bodies to whatever they want it to be. You know, it's just matter. It's not particularly good. So I'm going to define myself as I think that I am, which, you know, the church says, no, you can't. You're made male and female. In fact, we had, dates me 40 years ago, there was this group out in California that they committed suicide, and they were all going to be released. And there was a spaceship behind the moon that they were all going to land on. And when they got there, they committed suicide, but they were, taking the bodies out, and the men were all castrated. If that's not Gnosticism, I don't know what is. The body's evil. But, we know from creation that God created it. He said, it's good. It's very good. Another interesting character of this time is Tertullian. And one of his famous sayings is, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of Christians, which was true. And he was a very famous early Christian during this time period. But he died a heretic. He left the true faith and became a Montanist, and then he started his own group of people, and he died outside the church. When we were teaching this class one time on history, this one, we had a woman in the class that said, after hearing that story about Tertullian, said, it's a shame he didn't die sooner before he became a heretic. Bar Kokhba, does anyone know who he is in Jerusalem? He led the last of the Jewish revolts in the year 120 or 23 or something like that. And it was a very bloody war to put that down, but that was the very last of the Messianic Jewish warriors, revolting in Israel at the time. It was bloody, bloody, bloody war. And I think I've read after this that you could buy a Jewish slave cheaper than you could buy a donkey. Diocletian and the Great Persecution. At the end of the 4th century, Diocletian is the emperor, and they killed thousands and thousands of Christians at this time. Many of them they would torture and mutilate, but thousands of Christians died during this great persecution. This is around year 300, beginning of the 4th century. Many of them were sent to the salt mines and tortured prior to, had eyes gouged out. They would cut a tendon in their foot so they could walk with a limp. They couldn't run away. They castrated many of the men that I guess it would have to be a man, but that they took into the salt mines. And a brutal, brutal period in time with this particular persecution. And it was the last great persecution. There were still persecutions later, but this is one where tens of thousands of Christians were killed. And, as a former Protestant or growing up Protestant, I never got any of this. You know, these people died. They went to their death for their faith. You know, unbelievable in the way that many of them died. Now, many of them became apostates, but and that was another issue later. But the thousands that would not recant and went to their death. You know, could I do that today? If you pointed a gun at my head, would I be able to do this? Would you? I don't know. I hope so. One of the famous ones that on his execution was St. Lawrence. They wanted him to bring out the riches of the church. This is in Rome. And what he did is he brought out all these poor Christians and said, here they are. And they didn't like that much. So his execution was to be roasted alive. They built a big fire. They put him on a rack. And the famous line from St. Lawrence is, you can turn me over now, this side's done. So they were brutal in the way that they killed. St. Perpetua and St. Felicity were killed in the Colosseum, very bloody. I believe it was Perpetua, I can't remember which one, had just given birth to a child a few days earlier. And they took the child away, they marched him in, and they were killed by the wild beasts in the Colosseum. Now, this is interesting. At the end of the 4th century, or 3rd century, no, end of the 4th century, the 300s, going into, you had, the emperor died. And you had Maxentius was the heir apparent. He was in Rome. Constantine, and that's a name most of you probably have heard of, with just as a historical figure. He was up in Great Britain with his father, and his father was he was a bigwig in the eastern part of the empire. Well, he died as well. They both got declared the emperor, Maxentius in Rome, and Constantine was up in Great Britain, and his army named him emperor. And they said, we got to go claim Rome. Well, Maxentius had a much bigger army than did Constantine. But Constantine's army convinced him that we got to go take Rome. So they started marching south, and they had a vision in the night, and that was he saw Constantine, the Cairo, one of the symbols of Christ, and it said, under this symbol you will be victorious, was what he was told. So he had all of his troops put the Cairo, the X and what looks like a P, on their shields, and they started marching south. His army was half the size of Maxentius. They get down there, and Maxentius had a dream too that said, the emperor will win today. And he said, that's me. So they had one of the major bridges was shut down to keep people like Constantine from coming across it and going in the city. So he decided he's going to go out and win the day against Constantine. So they construct this little pontoon bridge, and they march across it. So they get across, and you've got this army beating down on them, and they're all clustered together, and they're defeated right there at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. And the story is that the last time that that Maxentius was seen was floating face down in the Tiber River. And Constantine marched into the city and just took it over. But with a much smaller army, and Maxentius, got a little heady and ahead of himself, thinking that I've got the biggest army and I've had this vision, the emperor will win today. Well, the emperor did, but it wasn't him. And this is important because of just a few years later, the Edict of Milan came out making Christianity legal. Up until that point, it was not legal. You could not be a Christian. Now, even so, about 15% of the empire was Christian. I mean, that's how it had grown in that 300 years. Now, after it was made legal, so you could come out of the shadows and practice your faith, the number of Christians in the Roman Empire doubled. It ended up being about 30%. Which is, amazing from that little time at Pentecost with the 12 apostles there, to see it with all the murders and suppressions and things going on, that it grew to millions and millions of people. Now, you would think being legal now, everything's hunky-dory, right? We're all going to live happily ever after. Well, the devil works in devious ways, demonic ways. And the attacks on the church wasn't next. It didn't come from outside the church. It came from inside the church. There was a bishop in the East called Arius. And Bishop Arius convinced well over half the bishops it was like more like 3/4 of them, that Jesus was not divine, which is important to our faith, right? He is divine. He's both God and man. And Arius believed that there was a time, not being divine, he was just a good man. And that took root, particularly in the Roman army. And, a lot of your upper class Romans, if you told them that, you're on par with Jesus, you can be like him, they'd say, yeah, that's me. I'm a Roman. And so it took off, and it took the Council of Nicaea and St. Athanasius to get rid of that notion. That was a major crisis in the church. That was a hinge point in history back in the 4th century there, with the Arian controversy. And the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Constantinople 50 years later, we say that statement of faith. We're going to have a class on it. The Nicene Creed came out of this period in history, but it emphatically stated what we believe as Catholics and Christians. But it took this attack from the outside in the form of this, this Arianism to make that happen. Now, Julian the Apostate, his mama must not have liked him much to give him that name. No, he was a baptized Christian, but he became an emperor, but he apostatized, but he wasn't an emperor very long, and so the church continued to grow. During this time, you got St. Augustine. His writings are great. City of God, Confessions, other writings of this period from him. Now, he was a pagan, and his mother Monica is a saint as well. Just prayed every day for his conversion, every day. He had a son, an illegitimate son, by a woman he never married. He took both of them to Italy and to Rome with him. He wanted to, move up in civil society. And he found his concubine to be an impediment to him, so he sent her away, kept the son. But Monica kept praying, and he finally converted. And he was on his way back to Africa when his mother died shortly after his conversion. But he did make it back to Hippo in Africa, and the rest is history. Is one of the most famous bishops of the church. Pick up a copy of his Confessions of the City of God. They're very good reading. Saint Benedict was the beginning of the monastic movement and the missionaries and the emperor. You had the conversion of England in the St. Augustine of Canterbury. England was a Catholic country until Henry VIII. 600 years later. During this time, the Muslims invade Spain in 711, and they're not really kicked out. They're there for 700 years. They're not kicked out until 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire, Charlemagne went to Spain to fight the Muslims. The only defeat he ever had was in Pamplona, or in Spain, trying to get out of the country, and his nephew was killed and his army routed. But one of the famous early Holy Roman emperors. And councils continue to deal with heresies. In fact, I've got, it's amazing the number of heresies that attack the church. Gnosticism, which we talked about. We had Arianism, which we talked about. Donatism, that's the validity of the sacraments depends on the worthiness of the minister. No, it doesn't. That had to be dealt with. Nestorius, Christ is two persons. It was in the 400. Mary is not the mother of God. Monophysitism, that's a mouthful. Christ has only one nature. No, he's got two. And on with what they had to deal with, in that first 1,000 years. People that didn't believe what the church was teaching, and they broke away with these heretical movements. The Great Schism in 1054. Cardinal, the head guy in the Eastern Church at that time banned really the Latin Rite in the East, in the Eastern Church. So the Pope sent a cardinal over there to set him straight, and it spiraled down. This cardinal excommunicated the head of the Eastern Church and put a papal bull on his altar in the Hagia Sophia. The guy came in, took the bull and burned it, and then excommunicated the cardinal. And so that schism, boom, in 1054, the church split in two in the East and the West. In fact, it's still apart this day. The Orthodox and the Roman Catholics are not back together. There's been efforts to do it. Pope John Paul said it's like the church is breathing on one lung because of this. And he went there to Constantinople, now it's Istanbul, and met with them. And going through the streets, you even had Christians in 1990 holding up signs that said 1054. That's how, 1,000 years later, it's still. We're gonna fast.
Just giving you a 5-minute warning.
Okay, all right.
I'll come back and get you.
Then you had the Crusades. And the first crusade is successful. Now, the church in the East and in Jerusalem, they wanted relief. Muslims were not exactly friendly to the Christians there living in the Holy Land or the parts that they controlled. And they asked for help to be relieved. And so this first crusade was very successful. They did take over Jerusalem and expel the Muslims. And they were able to protect the pilgrims going to the Holy Land. Now, as these things went on, they degenerated into things that were not very good. In fact, the Fourth Crusade is the worst. They were supposed to go to Jerusalem. They went to Constantinople and they sacked it. That wasn't their charge. I guess so many of them were looking for wealth and fame, but thought they'd find it there. But that one was a disaster. So unity with East and West, it's lost after that, really, with the sacking of Constantinople. some good things that happened, the rise of your mendicant orders, that's St. Francis of Assisi, St. Clare, St. Dominic. The mendicants, they're beggars. They're not funded by anybody but what they can go out and collect. And they're still that way today. You know, they all take a vow of poverty. And we had Father Bala here, was a Franciscan priest, still is a Franciscan priest, but he was our priest for 10 years. And, you know, would give talks on St. Francis and that particular order. But probably the Franciscans and the Dominicans are the two most famous, you know, of your orders out there. What now? Well, St. Benedict, yeah, you know, he was the very first with the, and his Monte Cassino, it's still there in Italy. You can see it on a mountaintop as you're driving past it. Okay, well, let's go eat. And we'll come back and try to do a little more. Does anybody have any questions on anything? You know, you can interrupt me anytime, it doesn't matter. Now, how do I pause this?
Just pause, share.
Oh, right there. All right, good. Thank you.
We talked about all my song stuff on YouTube. That's how she got all back into it.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, man, there's so much, there's so much to find.
Let's take it, you watched the.
Like all the time.
That's good, I like that.
One of his favorites.
No, I went to the
All right, you're
So
you're
I didn't
going,
go
and
to a concert,
it says,
and I knew
okay.
it was gonna be,
All right, we're recording again now.
4 to
Sorry.
12 hours, like they don't have like a 8 or 6, it's like, you know. So we get back, we've got one of those little notices on the car saying, you know, you got a ticket, basically, it's a ticket from the company. And then the next day, it charged my card.
For the ticket?
No, for the
Oh.
the amount I was gonna pay.
Right.
So I'm like, well, and then it says, if you want to dispute it, you gotta get on our, of course, there's no phone number at all.
No.
Never.
But the charge was only $10 more than what it would cost me anyway. Like it wasn't cheap for 12 hours, but yeah, just beware. I probably did not, just speaking of, if you did that right or wrong, you may have been, you didn't order it.
Right. No, I got a confirmation email.
So, yeah.
All right, let's,
I'm old, I can't use these barcodes. Or CR, what they call them?
in Crusaders and Scholars, I forgot to mention Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas at the bottom, doctor of the church. Famous theologian. You get into this catechism and you'll see citations from St. Aquinas quite often in there. Wrote a lot on everything. You know, he'd fill up that wall with stuff he wrote, but he was very big into faith and reason and had all of the arguments for the belief in God, and the 5 primary ones. There's a lot more than that, but it's worth going through. And there's if you look it up on Amazon or somewhere, get one of the synopsises of his writing. There's some called his Summa Theologica is real thick. It's hard to get through. Bishop Barron has written on Aquinas and his arguments. And there's several others that really boil it down into very understandable English, which I need because he's deep. I mean, if you want to put out in the deep water, pick up Thomas Aquinas. Okay, weak leaders and schism. We're into this now. You're getting very powerful kings and all through Christendom here, and King Philip IV of France is one of those. Begins taxing the church and infringing on its independence. Boniface VIII confronts him. He's attacked by the king and he dies. We see a lot of that going through history. You saw it in England when Henry VIII took over the church, and there were all but 2 people. There was only one bishop that did not sign the documents that Henry VIII wanted him to sign, which made Henry VIII the leader of the church. And that was Cardinal Fisher. He didn't, and he was beheaded along with many others. Dante writes, has anybody read the Divine Comedy? Great book, especially the Inferno, where he's with Virgil descending down into hell. And there's these stages going at the very top, the very first ring is sexual crimes. People, I guess that's one of the most basic that Dante saw in terms of sins. But as you go deeper, there's more bad sins and so forth in the rings. He's got one ring where it's popes, and they're in there upside down in a hole with their feet on fire. In fact, I think it's one of the Bonifaces that he has down there by name, but he names several, but the church doesn't know who's in hell and never mentions anybody's name. Dante did, but the church does not do that. It's a good read, and when he gets to the bottom into hell, Satan is frozen in ice from like his chest down, which is an interesting depiction of him. Bishop Barron has a lecture about that, about the Satan being frozen in ice, but it's what he finds when he gets down there before he starts making his way back up in purgatory. Interesting read. You had the papacy that moved to France for 70 years. It was up there. And it took Catherine of Siena convince the Pope up there to bring it back to Rome. But you had a lot of French popes, and there was a lot of reluctance to do that. France was the most Catholic country at that point in time, the most powerful country. You had the plague at this time during this period. What are our numbers here on this period? Yeah, we're talking about time period of around 1200 to the late 1400s, weak leaders and schisms. The plague killed 23 million people in Europe alone. We had the Great Western Schism. We had 3 popes at one time. So the church has been through an awful lot, and I'm still amazed that heck, we're still here. And somebody was asked, I think he was a bishop, and that's years ago, won't this kill the church? And his response was, 2,000 years of bad priests can't kill the church. This issue certainly isn't going to do it. So it'll stand the test of time. Any issue that we've had, we've always made it through. Constantinople falls to the Muslims in 1453. Protesters and defenders. You had obviously the most famous are the Martin Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli. But prior to that, you had Jan Hus and John Wycliffe, who were rejecting the sacraments and were off on their own doing things. Hus and Wycliffe are really called proto-Protestants. You had Henry VIII, he confiscates church property, shuts down monasteries, and takes their property. And what he did with all that property, they made money off property. He gave it to all his friends, so you had a lot of Englishmen that became instant millionaires when Henry VIII gave them that property. And going from pretty much nothing to very wealthy, they weren't about to give it back. So, the Catholic Church was essentially tossed out of. You had 1 or 2 monarchs that tried to reestablish it, but it never came back. In fact, and you've got Elizabeth I in persecution. She martyred at least 700 Catholics. Her sister was called Bloody Mary, but Elizabeth I was really your Bloody Elizabeth. She really persecuted the church. At the same time, this is going on. You had Our Lady of Guadalupe down in just north of Mexico City, where Juan Diego, who is an Aztec, who's a recent convert to Catholicism, he's going to church, to mass, and to classes. And he walks on this hill, Tepeyac, and he hears this beautiful voice calling to him. And he sees the vision of Our Lady of Guadalupe. I don't see one. Yeah, there she is, right there. You see that one right in the middle there? That's the vision. Well, that was on his stillman, I'm sorry. He saw her, and she was pretty much looking like that. And she told him to go see the bishop because she wanted a church built on this property up on Tepeyac Hill. So he goes to the bishop and says, I saw this woman that told me to come tell you to build a church. He said, I'm not doing that. Give me a sign. So he went back to and saw her again, and said, the bishop wants a sign. So she said, go to the top of the hill. and he went to the top of a hill, and it's wintertime. And he collects all of these Castilian roses and puts them in his tilma, carries it down and to the bishop, and they're in the room with the bishop, and he drops his tilma, and that's what they saw on that tilma. That tilma is still there 500 years later, hanging in the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe, just north of the city. And you can go there. I've been there. I was there on any given Friday, just at 9 o'clock mass. There were 2,000 people in there at this church. Amazing. We had 20 plus priests saying bishop or saying mass. There was a bishop involved in the mass. It was just incredible. I have no idea. That's back when, I had trouble with Mary the first couple of years I was a Catholic. So I got to figure this out. So I was on a business trip down to Mexico City, and I just said, I'll stay over the weekend. I want to go up there and take a look at this thing. So I did, and saw it, and started reading everything I could get on the apparitions. And there's 15 of them that are approved by the church. And that's one of the oldest ones in 1531. And, I became convinced, this is all, everything that's said about Mary is true. And I've had a devotion to Mary ever since, and that's been about 10 years ago. The three famous ones, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Zwingli. It's amazing how Protestantism began to split. These guys knew each other, knew of each other. They were all in the same area, Switzerland, Germany. They didn't believe the same thing. They all believed in sola scriptura, but it was their interpretation, not the other guys. So it started splitting almost from the very beginning, and there's over 30,000 different Protestant churches. In the U.S. alone, there's 200 each year. They're mostly non-denominational, but there are 200 each year that are founded that don't have an affiliation with anything else, which I find amazing.
I think Martin Luther, after a while, finally, did he write a letter, basically, kind of messed up?
No, not that I know of. The older he got, the more radical he got, from what I've read about him. And I think he was kind of unstable to begin with. At least a biography I read years ago about that. It was just, he was, what do you call it? He'd go to confession, and he'd be in there for an hour or 2 hours with a priest. He'd come out 30 minutes later, he'd run back in and start confessing again. He was, what do you call that? There's a word for it.
OCD?
What's that?
OCD?
Yeah. But there's a word the church defines on that, and I can't recall it right now. I'm getting old. Anyway, you had and I don't have it here, but you had the Anabaptists that came into Switzerland at the same time. These three guys, Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli, believed in infant baptism. And the churches that they founded still do today. You had the Anabaptists that came on about the same time in Switzerland, and that caused a huge firestorm with Zwingli. Zwingli persecuted him and ran him out of the country. They fled down to the Netherlands. They ended up coming to the U.S. as Amish Mennonites. But they did not believe in infant baptism. So it's interesting, the foundations of the mainline Protestant churches do believe in infant baptism. It wasn't, the Anabaptists did not. I think later, and I can't remember what century the Baptists were formulated, but obviously they do not. Church of Christ does not. A lot of your fundamentalist Catholics don't believe in infant baptism, but originally with the Protestant churches, they did. Obviously, the Catholic Church does.
The Methodist Church does.
Yeah, they baptize infants.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
Christian, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I was.
But then you're baptized after confirmation.
Not in the Methodist Church. We didn't have confirmation, I don't think.
Yeah, I My parents didn't do it.
You didn't go enough.
Your parents did it wrong, man.
Yeah. It was a southern, old, small southern town. I remember going to Bible school, but not confirmation. Swear, yeah. When you were older too?
But I wasn't Methodist, I wasn't born in a Methodist church, so that's probably why.
Right.
But I think christening is not the same as baptism in Methodist churches.
They recognize it, the Catholic Church recognizes it as a baptism.
Well,
They recognize
there's a few that we don't recognize. The Mormon baptism, we don't. They'll baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but they believe that you can be on par with Jesus Christ if you're good enough over time. And their conception of the Trinity is very different than the Catholic Church. And there's some others that we don't recognize either. It's interesting with, I came out of the Church of Christ and I've seen it split. My brother's church down outside of Montgomery, he left it because this church decided that the Holy Spirit had no involvement in the world or in your life anymore. So I guess they just thought he was a retired writer. Huh? I don't know. So he and a group left, but I've heard of some in the Church of Christ that don't baptize according to the Trinity. And if they don't, then we won't accept your baptism in the Catholic Church. Now, if you have been, we don't require you to be baptized again. We do require proof of baptism, usually in a written document. When I came in, I was baptized properly, but the church that I was baptized in back in 1960 was torn down and there was nothing left of records or anything. It's all gone, disappeared for years. So Father Bala did a provisional baptism for me, which you want to do if you really don't have, good solid proof that you've been baptized. Everybody been baptized? Or no? Yeah, we're in the Bible Belt, so most of the people that come through have been baptized. We usually have maybe one or two every year that have not, but in the main, everyone has been baptized. It's unusual, I think, in the South to find people that haven't been, that are going to church anyway. The response to the Protestant, and that was really a Protestant revolution. I mean, they rethought what church is and man's role in it. The church, there were a lot of problems in the church. One of the main ones that Luther was complaining about was the selling of indulgences. And that was to finish building St. Peter's in Rome at the time. And it was scandalous. It should not have been done. At any rate, the response of the church to this came too late. It was in 1645 that the Council of Trent came together and began the reforms that were necessary, some pointed out by Luther, some that they'd known about for years and didn't do anything about. And some of the things that came out of it, again, was the endorsement of the Nicene Creed, defined the nature of original sin, began the doctrinal review of sacraments, created seminaries. They found that their priests, many of them were ignorant, did not know what they really needed to know to be a good parish priest. Authorized formation of a universal catechism. And that catechism came out in 1565. You can get it. I've got it on my Kindle. And the sections in it are very much like what's in the current catechism. It's an interesting read. Required bishops to reside in their diocese. You had bishops that would have more than one diocese. And it's important for a bishop to live in his diocese to know what's going on. You can imagine back then there was no telephone. I guess you could write a letter and give it to a courier and get it somewhere. But if your diocese was in Sicily and you lived in Naples, that's not a good thing. And a lot of that was going on and needed to be reformed. Really brought definition to things we believe, purgatory, the veneration of saints, and indulgences. They reform the indulgences. There's no selling of indulgences. That's not happening in the church anymore after this problem. Required the priests to reside in their parish and wear clerical garb. So, well, the plenary indulgence will rid you of your all of your sins up to that point in your life. And there are certain things you can do. You can walk the Camino de Santiago and you can get a plenary indulgence. Now you've got to go to confession and do a number of other things. But it's things like that. You don't hand over money to the church to get an indulgence. But it's you get rid of the temporal punishment for that sin. No, your sins are forgiven, but the indulgence gets rid of the punishment.
Paying for forgiveness.
Yeah.
Yeah, here's some gold to the, like, your cardinal, and he'd be like, oh, you know, you didn't have to go through, yeah.
So that's what an indulgence or plenary indulgence is. There's partial indulgences as well as books on it. Like if you want to get one for us, the Camino de Santiago, you got to walk 500 miles and do some other things. But
Like at one time or like throughout the whole year? Like just all context, you know?
The one coming up is on, is it All Souls Day, which is October 2nd, I think?
November.
November, that's what it is, yes, it's November. They offer a plenary indulgence, like if you go to the graveyard that's up in Nashville where they do the Latin Mass, and you do the series of stuff that
Right.
you're supposed to do before you go there. Go to that, and you can receive a plenary indulgence.
Yeah. There's a whole book on indulgences that you can get that tells you what they are, what you need to do, and so forth. I don't do a lot of that. I guess I'll spend a lot of time in purgatory, I hope. Part of that Reformation too was St. Ignatius of Loyola and the Jesuits. He and his group pledged complete loyalty to the Pope. And the Jesuits were very, very big in education. These were bright guys. St. Ignatius was a soldier, and the story behind him was in the Battle of Pamplona. A cannonball hit him on the inside of one of his legs and kind of messed him up pretty bad. So he was an invalid for a couple of years, and he wanted to read books about chivalry and war and so forth. And where he was convalescent and he couldn't walk, all they had was books on the saints. So he started reading these books, and he had just a major conversion, and founded the Jesuits after that, and went to Rome and got the blessing of the Pope. And the Jesuits grew and grew and grew. They're still prevalent, not as much as they were years ago, but you still have lots and lots of Jesuits. Yeah. Battle of Lepanto was when they defeated the Muslims. It was a naval battle, and they carried signs of the Virgin Mary, Our Lady of Guadalupe, into that battle. Very superior army that the Muslims had, but they won it anyway and repelled the Muslims out of Italy. Galileo, we all have heard about that affair. And Galileo attempted to answer metaphysical, philosophical questions with physical answers. He believed and advocated that science is superior to and supplants faith. He got if you read about this, he got a little ahead of his data. What he said was confirmed to be true, but they didn't have the data when he said it, so that's how he got into trouble. But, you know, he died a Catholic. He was born and raised a Catholic. He was educated as a Catholic. You know, he wasn't thrown into prison and things that the myths that you hear about Galileo. But there was that issue of, you know, faith and reason back then, and Galileo, as a scientist, kind of fell to the side of reason alone on things. But and Pope John Paul II, this is one of his best statements. It said, "Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth." You know, you're not going to rise unless you got two wings. If one of them's missing, you're going to spiral down. Revolution and modernism. French Revolution, 1790s, 1789 to 1794. 20,000 are executed, 30,000 priests are exiled. Priests and bishops are imprisoned and executed. Reason becomes the new God. They took a church over, Catholic Church, and named it the Temple of Reason. 1794, Robespierre had 15 Carmelite nuns and one novice put in carts, paraded around Paris, taken to the guillotines, and had their heads cut off. Monumental prayer, and these were they were contemplatives. They
wouldn't take their habits off.
They didn't have anything else to put on. They gave their other clothes to these Dominicans that got shipped off to England.
And they're the martyrs of Compiègne. I don't know how to say it. And they went up to the guillotine singing praise to the Lord. All of them.
Everyone, beginning with the novice first, and all 15 of them were beheaded. The Mother Superior, but these were cloistered nuns. Why Robespierre wanted them dead is just a mystery to anybody that looks back on the period of time. In fact, I think their day of martyrdom was last month. It's interesting. They took these Dominican sisters and put them in the Carmelites' everyday clothes and shipped them back to England. 10 days after their execution by guillotine, Robespierre was dragged out of his living quarters. He tried to kill himself, but he botched it. He shot his jaw off. They dragged him out of his living residence, took him over to the guillotine, very close to the Temple of Reason, and cut his head off. And the Reign of Terror ended. But, you know, this is the time of Rousseau and Voltaire as well in France. And Voltaire was probably, he believed in God. Rousseau did not. Rousseau thought that he could perfect himself by himself. So, and, you know, the order didn't get restored until Napoleon, which at the 1800s, early 1800s. And he came to Italy and took the Pope hostage. But he saw the usefulness of the church and restored some of the freedoms. But the Italians kind of got back at him. There's a famous statue of Napoleon's sister. It's a reclining nude, in an art place down in Rome. It's it's very well done, but I don't think Napoleon liked that too much. And I don't think his sister liked him much either. But the Commune of 1871, the reason is the only thing that you need to have. The Commune of 1871 was in Paris. You're 75 years after the French Revolution. The communists took over Paris. 25,000 people died in this. They executed the Archbishop of Paris, killed priests and others, took over churches, repurposed churches. They were only there for 3 months because the French army had encircled the city and they didn't want another reign of terror. They kind of got one anyway with 25,000 dead. So the French army kept squeezing in, and they finally took the city back, and they were taking these insurrectionists, lined them up against the wall and shot them. But, it was a mini terror, I guess, in 1871, the communists, which there's books written about it. They're really fascinating, but it's just amazing that the use of reason and how much terror and killing comes out of that. Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, famous encyclical. Write this down. You want to read it. It's not that long. It's an easy read. Where Leo XIII is one of my favorite popes. It's about the rights of workers and the rights of businessmen and capital. And it's the balance that the Catholic Church took back then. And he condemned socialism in no uncertain terms as not being compatible with the teaching of the church. He was alive when that communist takeover of Paris took place in 1871. And he saw what the communists did there. And I think that had an impact on him. But, you had rights on both sides. Extreme capitalism he condemned, socialism he totally condemned. But it's a good read about the balance between workers and owners. St. John Paul II reissued it's called Centesimus Annus. He did that in 1992. Very good reads. If you want to get into some encyclicals that have a lot of meat to them, these are two that do. Our Lady of Fatima, 1917. We're running out of time. But
There's a movie about Our Lady of Fatima that just came out. It's good to watch. Kind of give you some background on that. It was an apparition of Our Lady, but it also had to do with the communists and what was going on in Portugal.
right. Oh, he is?
It's a name and actor that's, yeah.
Well, I know her.
It's a pretty good, it's not like.
He's an old guy like me.
Yeah. He's the one that interviews the one that's still
Oh,
alive.
that's right.
What's her name?
Lucia.
Yeah.
She's not
I
alive.
know the story really well.
Yeah.
One did not.
And there were 3 children in Portugal that Our Lady.
Not to spoil it for you guys.
Saint Maximilian Kolbe and Edith Stein. We'll get to them when we talk about saints, but they're got caught up in World War II. Kolbe was killed in a concentration camp, and so was Edith Stein, Saint Benedict of the Cross. The new springtime. John the 23rd, Pope Paul VI, Second Vatican Council. Another one that I think you ought to read, all of these are good, Humana Vitae by Pope Paul VI. Has anybody read that? Read that.
Read it. It's so good. They were actually in existence of church teaching on life and the dignity of life, and he basically prophesied in that all of the things that were going to happen if we
Exactly. The Summer of Love was 1967, summertime. I was going into my senior year in high school. Anybody remember the Summer of Love in San Francisco? You're too young.
Haight Ashbury, we've seen movies.
Yeah. Well, the next year in 68 is when he wrote Humana Vitae. And all of the dreadful things from the sexual revolution he predicted in this document, including the forced sterilization of women that you saw in China, the forced abortions in China, all of this. You ought to read that. I mean, it's like, wow.
He said if we go down this path, this is what's going to happen. And
It did.
everything he said happened.
So, what happened? All right, we're done. Oh, there we go. Is that my last one?
Threshold of hope.
Yeah, St. John Paul, assassination attempt, theology of the body, great work. Catechism of the Catholic Church that he did, version 2. You got a copy if you don't get one. Crossing the Threshold of Hope by John Paul II. Read it, great book. World Youth Days were founded by St. John Paul II. They're still going on today. they're just massive events with the youth around the world. First one was in Denver, wasn't it? Yeah. Years and years and years ago. And so, Pope Benedict XVI, and we're down to Pope Francis. I think I said he was number 267. So as you go through church history, 267 popes, we've got popes who are just absolute giants, and we've got popes of less stature. But it doesn't make any difference. You got to pray for the Pope. He's Christ's vicar on earth. You're not going to agree with everything a Pope says. You don't have to, unless he speaks from the chair of the.
It's called ex cathedra. If he
Right.
speaks ex cathedra from the chair, that means that's like infallible teaching. And it's only been done twice. And both of them were about Mary. But a pope can't be like, oh, you have to believe that the sky is pink.
Right.
You can be like, yeah, you're wrong. So that could be his personal opinion. Maybe he's colorblind. But you don't have to agree with that. But if he's speaking from the chair, that's the stuff that's into.
This is what the church believes, so you need a copy of that and get familiar with it. In fact, you need to get a teaching Bible. And this is the one that I recommend right here that I use. It's called the Dedicated. It's an RSV version.
Which I did order you guys a Bible, and it's the Ignatius Study Bible, not the dedicated one. But
Same thing. It's got.
There's the same translation.
Right.
But I think we're having a supply chain issue, and they were like back ordered, and so it's not going to be here till October. So you get the teen Bible in the meantime. That is the New American Bible translation, which is a little bit less strict to the original language. But I did order you one. You will be getting one.
What I like about this one is that it goes along with the Catechism. For instance, in Luke right there, Luke 9:10-17, multiple pages below that he's going through, and at the bottom it gives you other citations, Matthew and John. But it also takes you back to paragraphs in the Catechism at the bottom. So you can go there and learn more about what the church is teaching on this particular scripture.
I'm stopping the recording. Okay.
Okay. I'm done.
Yeah.